Hello and welcome to Broad History, a podcast about the history you think you know with women in it this time. I'm your host, Isabelle Rogal. You know, doing women's history can make you angry. History is full of dark stories, women's history especially. You get angry at the systemic injustice and the systemic failures. You get angry that we seem to be fighting the same battles over and over again. You get angry because you read so much more misogyny than you thought was even possible. You get inspired by incredible women who pushed boundaries and contributed so much to humanity, but then you get angry because they were completely forgotten while every single-term undersecretary of commerce seems to have a statue somewhere. And then you read your YouTube comments and you get really angry. And I don't want to be angry. And so you try to do this with humor and fun and a sense of joy, because this is fun, at least if you're a nerd, as I am. And then you make some episodes that are a little bit of candy. And today is candy. This episode is not for children, and maybe don't listen with your parents in the room either. Today I am speaking with sex historian Dr. Kate Lister. She is the host of the podcast Betwixt the Sheets, try and say that fast, and the author of a new book, Flick, A History of Female Pleasure. And we talked about the crazy ideas over the centuries that people have had about women's sexuality. Let me tell you, it's a ride. So here we go, Dr. Kate Lister. Kate, hello, welcome. So great to have you.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me on.
My pleasure, absolutely. I want to start with something that I think is going to sound unexpected to a lot of listeners. It's one of those mental models that you learn to flip when you start getting into women's history, which is that for quite a long time, for most of our history, really, it was women who were thought of as the more sexual beings of the two genders, if we're sticking to the binary here. So it wasn't boys will be boys, it was girls will be girls.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. That goes right back to some of the earliest medical writing that we have. And it's tied up with this idea that women can't control themselves in general. And we still live with the echoes of this today, the idea that women are more emotional than men, that women are more sensitive, that our feelings are more acute than men's, again, if we're just working with the binary. And for most of our history, sex was part of that. So it's this idea that women just can't control themselves, that they are emotionally unstable, and part of that was sexual desire. Now, that might sound like a win, like, yay, go us, we get to have loads of fun. No. What was part of that was the idea, so therefore women need to be controlled at all costs. And they need to be married off, and they need to have access to regular sex because their wombs are all hungry. And they it sounds funny when you read it, but that's really what they thought, is their wombs desire and crave babies, and we want babies, so therefore we want sex, and we want as much of it as we possibly can do, but we need to be controlled because we're not to be trusted, quite frankly. And that idea really stays with us. You can see it all throughout ancient Greece and going into ancient Rome, and you can see it in the medieval Islamic writers, and certainly when you're in the medieval period. The idea that women didn't like sex would have been very, very strange to them. Very strange. They would have looked at you completely blankly. It's like, I beg your pardon. It's really not until we start to get into the medicalization of everything, but particularly sex, in the late 18th and into the 19th century, that this idea emerges that women have a weaker sex drive than men do.
So that's very recent.
It's very recent.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that they thought men didn't experience desire. It's not that. It was the idea that men could control their urges, whereas women couldn't. We're just poor, silly, emotional women who, well, obviously we're just not to be trusted. Of course we're not.
No. And part of that comes down to a very original and primal and biological reasoning, which is men, poor them, have no way of knowing whether the baby is theirs, right?
Well, it's an ongoing and quite an intense debate amongst evolutionary biologists and feminists and historians in general of why is women's sexuality policed so much more heavily than men's sexuality is. Even today, that is still the case. We have vastly different attitudes around women's sex desire, sex drive, sexual experiences than men's do. And we don't even have to go that far back into the past to find it being very, very ferociously policed. What we're doing now, we're in a very hip and groovy and exciting time where we're starting to unshackle some of this. So there's a lot of debate about, yeah, but why? Why that? Why do we have this, like, go on, boys will be boys, spread your seed, sow your wild oats, but hands off my daughter, she's not, like, why do we do that? And the leading theory is that it's about if you're in a patriarchal society where everything is passed down the patrilineal line, then it becomes of primary importance of who is giving birth to whom, right? And the only way that you can really successfully police who is giving birth to who is by policing women's bodies in a wider context and who they get to have sexual access to. And you do that by enforcing these standards, because you must be a virgin. You must be a virgin until you get married, and then you must get married, which is a legally binding contract that you'll only be with this person forever and ever and ever. And if you do dare to have any sex outside that, we're going to viciously shame you. And in some times and places and examples, there's a legal mechanism to punish you for doing that as well, like adultery laws and horrible things that happen to people that cheated. And it's really all about who gives birth to who, and what goes along with that is inheriting titles and names and lands and those kind of things. So that's the leading theory, that the reason women's bodies are policed so much more aggressively is because it's about controlling who gives birth to who.
So you mentioned that switches, right, in the 18th century, sort of around the Enlightenment or Reformation, maybe a bit later. What happens?
So it's not like it's an overnight thing. It's not like everyone wakes up on a Tuesday and they go, right, we've got a different plan now, everybody. It is quite slow and gradual. And women's sexuality and their bodies has been policed aggressively for as long as we've been around. But you start to get this medicalization of sex in general that appears. And doctors have always been very interested in sex, but this idea of pathology and about mental health and psychology starts to emerge in the late 18th century, going forward into the 19th century. And then we get the sexologists, and then we go into the 20th century when we've got Freud. So you've got new attitudes to the medical field, and it being professional. It is a professionalized body as we're going forward. And in many ways, it becomes the new authority of who we're going to look to when it comes to health. And that's where we've ended up with today. That's why you go to the doctor and you don't go to the priest, or at least you shouldn't if you're feeling unwell. But what they start to do is to intensely categorise what is normal and what is not normal, what is abnormal, what is degenerate, what is dysfunctional. And they're so convinced that they're getting all this right, but unfortunately it is underpinned by prejudices at the time. So you start to get some very strange ideas turning up, like that you shouldn't be having too much sex at all, especially if you're a man. If you have too much sex, you lose your seed. And if you're masturbating a lot, then this idea emerges that could be very dangerous to your health because you're losing your vital essence. If you've ever been told by someone, like when you were a kid, that masturbation would make you go blind or would make your hands hairy, that's where that comes from.
Yeah.
And part of that is this intense focus on women's bodies and what is normal, what is not normal. And you start to get desire itself being pathologized, and you get this classification of nymphomania that turns up in the 1770s, which, reading through these texts now with modern eyes, it's genuinely terrifying, and it's just absolutely mad stuff. But it's the oldest grift in the book, is that you create a problem and then you sell the solution to it. And that's basically what they're doing. And pathologizing sex and sex desire is so clever because it's vicious, because it's something that, like, most of us, apart from the asexual community, but even they experience it in their own way, is that we all experience it, but it's shrouded with so much shame and stigma that we don't openly talk about it. And if you're suddenly reading texts and people are talking about this thing that you're doing is bad, it's bad for your health, you're like, oh my God, right, okay, I won't do that. And you take on board these messages and then you're panicking about it. So to do that is so effective. And you start to get this idea that any excessive sexual desire in anybody is a bad thing and it can be pathologized, but particularly in women, this idea emerges that excessive desire is a bad thing. And as you'd imagine, the bar for that is pretty low of what they mean as excessive, because it's just anything that isn't having sex with your husband when he wants to make babies can be excessive. So that's where it really starts to emerge, is when you've got doctors and budding psychiatrists attempting to categorize what is normal human desire.
Yeah, and the Victorian pamphlets of the decay of the woman or the boy from excessive masturbation. I mean, it's hilarious. They look like a drug addict that's like withering away, you know.
They do. It's like those awful like drug photographs that you get, like the faces of meth, where it's like, you know, before or after crystal meth. In the Victorians, it's like before or after masturbation. They really thought that it was very bad for your health.
Yeah, it's hilarious. And so you sort of went into two directions I want to follow. The first one is the medicalization. There are some hilarious medical ideas over the centuries, like starting really quite early on. I've got a whole list of them that I want to go through, like starting with the wandering womb.
The wandering womb. Yeah, that's the Greeks. We got them.
Yeah, we're going way back, but
way back. So this is like the Hippocratic writers. For them, they understood that most of what went wrong with women's bodies was related to the womb. It was like, if you've got a headache, it's your womb. If there's your foot sore, it's your womb. They were absolutely convinced. And I guess that's because they saw women in their society as their function is to have babies.
Right.
Their function is to have babies and
the woman is
provide
literally
sex.
a wandering womb.
She's a wandering womb. She is a womb. And it's very easy to laugh at this stuff, but they weren't stupid. They just started from terrible beginnings. They just didn't have all of the information, and this just made sense to them. So their theory around a wandering womb was that the womb literally moved around the body, and that it could move to different parts of your body, and that's what would affect your health. So if you had a headache, it might be that the womb was moved up towards your head. If you have a stomach ache, it might be because the womb is done there, and you can find mad cures and suggestions, ways to try and coax the womb back down to its position, which normally involved things like squatting over a fumigating like fire or something and like trying to smoke it back into place. The thing is, we don't know how widespread this was. That's the thing. I don't know if this is just every Greek woman was doing this, or if we've got just this is what some medical doctors are thinking.
Some quack and
right, just some quack. We don't know that. But what we do know is that we still see threads of this to this very day. Again, going back to the idea that women are more emotional than men, and that all of our emotions are tied to our reproductive cycles somehow. And that was very central to Greek idea around women's bodies, was that it was all about the womb because it's all about reproduction. Women are there to have babies and provide pleasure to men. So therefore, it's all about the womb. And you'd think that like once the Greeks had been and done, that somebody would have come along and gone, no, that's nonsense. Let's just not talk about that anymore. But that I was actually in force, like right up until the 19th century. They shift it slightly, and they come in with ideas around hysteria, which are all linked to your reproductive cycle. So they try and help women with mental distress by doing things like regulating menstruation, or in really extreme cases, doing things like cutting out the clitoris or cutting out the ovaries. I know it's rare, but it is on record. It did certainly happen, and it is spoken about in the literature of the time. I don't want anyone to think that your average Victorian woman would go down the pharmacy and they go, right, we'll get the scalpel out. That's just not what was happening. But it's there. And you get mad ideas about things like, when batteries are invented, is that we'll electrocute the womb. There's a patent for a womb battery that I found in 19th century America. Really, really mad stuff. But again, all focusing on we'll treat the womb and then we'll make the woman better. And that comes from the Greeks.
It's almost compared to the opposite that we have now, where sometimes the medical default is the men and we just ignore the hormonal cycle of women and all of that. We're almost in the opposite excess now.
We are almost in the opposite excess. Medical misogyny is a real thing. But I would also argue that I think that we're still within this. I still think that women are often defined by their hormones. I think that it's very easy to do that, is to say that maybe you should have a baby, or maybe it's your menstrual cycle, or maybe you're in a terrible mood because you've got PMS or things like that. And I think as well, like as thrilled as I am that we're talking about the menopause and the perimenopause now, and there's been a kind of a tidal wave of women going, fucking hell, can we talk about this? Thank God for that. Kind of what's swept along with that is, again, loads of cranks and loads of quack people peddling gibberish and nonsense. You don't need a menopause vibrator. You don't need, real product. You don't need special menopause shampoo. You don't need menopause pillowcases. It's just shite. But again, this idea is starting to creep in that women, again, are ruled by their emotions, are ruled by their womb, are ruled by this thing, this perimenopause. And I'm really in a state of cognitive dissonance about it, because I'm thrilled we're talking about it. But I can also see this linking back again to the idea that women are ruled by their reproductive cycles.
Yeah. And we're also making it terrifying. Middle-aged women have purchasing power, though. If there's something to be sold.
Yes, that's and they'll turn it purple and they'll jack the price up, and that's what will happen with a menopausal product. So yeah, I'm really pulled in different directions with that particular discussion.
Keeping on the theme of fun medical ideas, there's one that really intrigues me, which also is from like my favorite woman, Hildegard von Bingen, who I talk about pretty much every other episode because she's a legend. And of course, not no one knows her, but she's a lot less known than, she's like Da Vinci and like St. Augustine in one person.
Yeah, that's a good way of describing her. Yeah, she's impressive.
She's really impressive. She should be at least as famous as those guys. But anyway, one of the things she talks about is that female orgasms are necessary for conception.
Yeah, and Hildegard is probably the first person to actually describe a woman orgasming.
And she's a nun. She's a Catholic nun. And she's a saint
nun.
now. She's a Catholic saint.
She is a saint and a nun. And the reason I've caveated it is she might be the first is because there's possibly a Greek writer, one of the Hippocratic writers, who's talking about pleasure in women's bodies when they're having sex. And he might be talking about an orgasm. But just, I think that it's more likely that Hildegard is the first person. And the reason that she's writing that is she's not writing like a naughty book. She writes medical texts, and like all good Catholics and all good physicians, she's very interested in reproduction and how it works and what the optimal time for reproduction might be and all of these things. And it's completely mad, all of her book. I'm not sure any of it is actually right, but it was cutting edge for the time. And she taps into an idea that she wasn't the first person to say it, but she describes a woman orgasming, and she is describing it as being an aid to conception. And that is a very, very old idea. You see that again in the Greek writing, that women orgasmed in order to get pregnant. And this ties into an old idea, again, the Greeks, that women's bodies were basically failed men. That was their idea, right? So it's something called the one-body theory. So we know about Greek humoral theory, but also they had an idea that men and masculine bodies were created by a body being hot and dry, and a feminine body, a female body, was wet and cool. So gender difference for them was a matter of temperature. If you were a masculine presenting woman, then perhaps you'd become too hot and dry, and they needed to do things to try and chill you out and make you damper, cool you off, right? But what they believed is that the male body was perfect, that it was in the absolute perfection state, and that women's bodies were basically failed versions of that, and that they were inversions of that. They didn't see a vagina or a vulva in its own right. They saw an absence of a penis. They understood men orgasm because they need to ejaculate semen to make babies. It's all about making babies. Make the baby, make the baby, make the baby. So therefore, when women orgasm, it must be doing the same thing that a man's doing, because they are the same body, just of different temperatures. The mirror, right? So they come up with the idea that women orgasm as an aid to conception. And that stays with us for a very, very, very long time as well. It doesn't seem to have been universally accepted because there is a lot of evidence to the contrary, right? It's not that every time a woman orgasms, she gets pregnant. That's
and vice
not
versa.
true.
She gets pregnant
vice versa.
Without lots of fun.
Right? So, but they thought that's what it was. It was an aid to conception. And that's what Hildegard is writing about several centuries later, or 1,000 years later. So she's interested in basically making lots more little Catholics. That's why she's writing about it, because it's very important to them to have babies.
Yeah. I mean, if that can help women get theirs, great. But unfortunately, I mean, we saw it like even in very recent past, this Republican lawmaker who's like, you can't get pregnant from rape because the body has, quote, ways to shut that down.
Yeah.
What?
So it's, again, initially it sounds like a win of just like, oh, great. So they understood that orgasms are good things. Hurrah. But what you get is that actually being cited in rape cases right up to the 18th century, because you can see where the theory is that if a woman gets pregnant, she can't possibly have been raped because she must have had an orgasm. If she had an orgasm, she must have enjoyed it. And if she enjoyed it, she must have consented. So you actually get it being presented as reasons to dismiss rape cases. And then feeding right up, I think that was in 2012, and it was Todd Aitken, the Republican guy. He was talking about abortion and how you don't need abortions in cases of rape, because in cases of genuine rape, a woman's body has a way of shutting that whole thing down. I know, it's awful, isn't it?
It's the men making the laws for us.
Yeah.
And they have no idea how women
But
work.
that's just staggering of just like that level of medical ignorance, even today. You've got the entire world's knowledge and all of medical knowledge at your fingertips, in your phone, in your pocket, and that he would still just sit there and just come out with that absolute gibberish shite, a supposedly educated man, that the body will shut down pregnancy in the case of rape. What are you talking about?
And you mentioned a few times, obviously, all of this is centered around making babies, right? We're talking about very
babies.
heteronormative, reproductive, married, phallocentric. So it's really kind of a small subsection, not an insignificant, but it's not the entire sexual experience of the human race. Like, it's a very specific part of it.
No.
Is the rest of it kind of like under the radar and we leave you alone?
So as a culture, we have been historically, and I would argue are still, very obsessed with the idea that sex means putting a penis into something. Like, I think that if you actually like press pause on that and you ask people to unpack it, suddenly they start to realise that doesn't actually hold and it doesn't work. But it's a dominant viewpoint within our culture, and you can see it turning up in things like bogus virginity tests. You can't prove a virginity. It's complete and absolute nonsense. But still, all around the world, women, not men, are subjected to virginity tests. And what are they looking for, allegedly? They're not looking for evidence of cunnilingus or masturbation. They're looking for evidence of penetration, because that's what counts as real sex, right? Even the way we talk about foreplay, even on a linguistic level, the idea of play, that it's playing, it's not real sex, and that it's before the real event. We've just dismissed a whole load of sex acts. But that has been with us for such a long time and underpinning our entire understanding of what sex is, normal sex, sexual behaviour is, at least in the West. And what you tend to get is sex acts that don't serve that model tend to be stigmatised. That's what you tend to get. They have always been with us. They always will be with us. Gender variance has always been here. Same-sex attraction has always been here. Sex acts that don't involve putting a penis into something have always been here. But you get those acts stigmatised, and often laws are passed against them, like the sodomy laws passed by that bastion of sexual morality, Henry VIII. And it criminalised any sex act that wasn't for making babies, basically. So, yeah, this understanding that sex is putting a penis into something, that's what we need to dismantle. And the legacy of that today, less than 18% of women can orgasm through penetrative sex alone. Less than 18%. So the fact that we would dismiss all of those sex acts that women need to get to orgasm as foreplay or not the real deal, I think is very, very telling of us as a culture, and whose pleasure we are prioritising and have always prioritised. It's always about the penis and about serving the mighty rod.
Is this the reason that sort of historically lesbians have been relatively left alone? And I say relatively compared to gay men who have been targeted probably a bit more by repression.
I would say so, yes. There are other theories out there, but I think that's probably the biggest one, is that they don't represent the threat that gay men do to the patriarchy. And what gay men, the threat that they represent, is forcing a heterosexual man into the role of the woman, of being the person who is penetrated. That's where the shame lies. Even in cultures historically where same-sexual desire between men has been accepted, there's always been shame to being the quote-unquote the bottom, because that's the girl part, you see.
And who wants to be a girl, right?
Who wants to be a girl?
When you could be a man.
When you could be a manly man with your penis, and putting it into things and being dominant and tough. And we've still got this particular dynamic is still with us today, that women are framed as sexually submissive and men as being sexually active, and it's all complete and utter gibberish, and it's nonsense, but it's powerful nonsense, unfortunately. And one of the things that it did do is it certainly underpinned how same-sex between men was criminalised, because there's a penis involved and a penis can be put into something. Therefore, we can understand that is sex, and we can understand that that is a threat, not only to society, but to masculinity itself. I have heard it argued that homophobia is actually misogyny. That's what it is, because what they're really scared of is masculine apostates, basically, is that somebody wouldn't be a masculine man becoming feminine or taking the role of quote-unquote the girl during sex. That's what they're scared of. Whereas lesbians don't offer that threat, because there isn't a penis involved. And any woman that has sex with women, or any lesbian identifying women out there, will have heard at some point in their lifetime some variation on, but what do they do? What do they do in bed? They still hear that today, this misunderstanding because there's not a penis, as if lesbians are in bed with one another going, but what shall we do? I don't understand how this works. But it's probably one of the reasons why same-sex between women wasn't criminalised in the same way that men have been. And when lesbians have been understood historically, they're often understood as being very, very masculine, as wanting to imitate men, and that the sex that women have must be an attempt to imitate heterosexual sex. And you can see that in some of the language that's used to describe women having sex with women. One of my favourite terms from, I think it's the 17th century, is playing at flats. That is, yeah. So again, you've got that playing, it's not real sex. And flats refers to the absence of the penis. Again, in almost every language where you're looking at the word for lesbian, it's some play on grinder or rubbing. And it's because this idea that women must be imitating heterosexual sex and just rubbing their vulvas on one another.
The absolute irony of Grindr being
I know, right?
the gay sex app is hilarious. I have to say too, I think your next book should just be a dictionary of sexual euphemisms, because they're all over the book. They're hilarious. Some of them.
I do have a lot of fun with that, with the slang.
Yeah, you don't want to use the same words all over again, but turns out there was a lot of imagination around those things. There is one thing I wonder about is, was sex always something that was shameful and hidden? I mean, you make a great point in the book about sort of the invention of privacy and how that is a luxury that humans didn't have for a very long time.
Yeah. So no, sex has not always been, again, we're back to what you count as sex. But back to the question of how was sex, however you understand it, shamed? It's shamed in different ways at different times. Now, the idea of space is really interesting because throughout most of our history, and even today around the world, is that you will get families sharing one space, a large family sharing one space. Sometimes multiple families living together. That was pretty common even through into the early 20th century in some of the tenement areas in Britain. And obviously people are having sex in that space. I'm not saying that it's an orgy and that everyone was having sex on the kitchen table or anything like that, but the idea of privacy, that is very, very new. If you've got your own room and your own space and somewhere to go to have sex where no one will disturb you, that is quite a recent and new thing. Bodies weren't shamed in the same way that they are now. If you're looking at like the medieval period, for example, bodies just don't seem to have offended them. Why would they? They're everywhere. You've seen bodies. You grew up with bodies around you and bodily functions as well. Like, they don't talk about shitting and pissing in the same way that we do. They would name streets Shit Alley and Pissing Lane and Grope Cunt Lane where the sex workers were. It's very out there. That's just what sex is.
The toilets are shared, the baths are public.
Are shared, the baths are public. You've probably grown up in a room with your family, a large family. You might have a
one
family.
bed.
One bed, exactly. If you're going to service, then you will be sharing several people to a room until you get married and have your own family, and then you'll all be in a small space again. So sex is something that would have happened within that space, which would dramatically impact, I think, your idea of what is shameful and what is not shameful. So they have ideas around sexual behaviour that are considered shameful, but actual bodies, no, not so much. For that to emerge, you have to get the emergence of the middle class, the establishment of the middle class and middle class morality, and space. Space to be private, space to cover up and to have your body covered up. And you didn't have that for most of history.
You mentioned middle class morality, and we're going to go back to the Victorians. We owe them so much of our,
don't we?
Not in a great way, always, of our sort of gender role assumptions, mental models, and all of that. We've talked on the show before about the sort of the invention of the housewife. It's a very Victorian ideal. And the idea of the angel in the house, which is the pure woman, mother, desexed, asexual in a way, even though she's a mother at the center of the house. And I also want to talk about empire at the same time, because the angel in the house is a white woman, right? And what that means about, you know, the pure white lady versus everyone else.
The important thing to say about the angel in the house is that it's bollocks. It doesn't actually exist, and it's never existed. But it certainly existed in the minds of Victorian middle classes about this is the ideal womanhood, that femininity is domesticated. And in order to get that, you have to have an emergence of the middle class, and you have to have an emergence of a workforce in a way that didn't exist before. Because what you start to see in the 19th century is people leaving the home to go to work, that you would travel to an office, somewhere you go and do your job. Now, people have always travelled for work, realistically, but the model before that was largely you'd probably work where you lived. If you were a tanner or a cobbler or a blacksmith or a baker, you're living where you work. So you're not travelling somewhere to go and get it. But what you get in the 19th century, really starkly, is a separation between home and work. And also with moneyed classes, now is the idea that women should be at home and women shouldn't be working. That home is their little domestic bubble, and this ideal arises that men go out and do all the manly things in the public sphere and women stay at home and guard the virtue of the private sphere, and the two kind of complement one another. And it's taken from a poem by a guy called Coventry Patmore, who writes The Angel in the House and his wife, and about how she's doting and gentle and that she nurtures him and takes care of him, then he's ready to go out into the manly world again and do his thing. See, the problem with it is it's crap. It just doesn't exist. Like, it only exists for a certain select few people. Working class women, for example, they weren't ever going to be able. They worked. Women have. There's this idea that women haven't. We've always worked. We've always worked. It's just we just didn't get paid properly for that work. That's the issue, right? It's like working class women can't afford to stay at home being all weak and feeble. That's not how that played out. Women of colour, enslaved women, they certainly weren't going to go, I can't go and do that because I have to be at home and domesticated today. So it's gibberish, but it's very powerful gibberish. And that's where we start to get the association of women within the domestic sphere and this idea that women should be staying at home. And again, it's a very middle class ideal. But the thing about middle class morality is it is formative in shaping social norms. And the middle classes have always been terrified about their reputation in a way that upper class people just couldn't give a shit about. They don't need to worry about that at all. Or if you're very working class or if you're living in poverty, you've got your own shit to be dealing with, but probably your reputation as a lady that stays at home probably isn't one of them, right? So you get this ideal of femininity as being attached to the home and attached to the domesticated, and now she's going to be set up to be everything in opposition to what the man is. And the man is active and he's out there and he's sexual and dynamic, and she is at home and she's sexually passive. And that's where you start to get this from. Now with empire, this is very interesting how this works. So the Brits, and not just us, like a lot of European nations were doing it as well.
I'm French. Sorry.
And we did. We've just got to own it. They just kept going around the world and just turning up with a flag and going, we're in charge now, and taking over and colonizing and then extorting supplies and resources to their own ends. But sex plays a strange part in this process, because the only way that you can successfully colonize another group of people or subjugate another group of people is if you convince yourself that you're better than them and that they need you to do this, that you should be in charge, that there's a justification for what you're doing. And sex plays into that in really interesting ways. And you see this obsession with the sexuality of people in India and Africa and in the Caribbean and in everywhere that wasn't Europe. They're often framed as being luscious and luxurious, but also sexually louche and often very feminine. That tends to creep in with this as well. Whereas the colonizers, the Europeans, is we're very masculine and we can again control ourselves. We can control our urges. And the white woman starts to be understood in opposition to women of colour from nations that we are subjugating. So the white woman is at home being kind of sexless and domesticated. She isn't at all doing that, but that's this colonial fantasy. And in contrast are the Devadasi of India and the temple dancing girls and the women in Africa who were bare-breasted, and they can't conceive of this in any other way than these women are insanely highly sexed. That's what's happening. It's bizarre. They're weirdly sexed. So therefore, they need us, the Europeans, to control and subjugate them, but also fantasize and eroticize and fetishize them all at the same time. It's a whole tangled mess. And the white woman is held up as this virginal paragon of everything that these cultures aren't and what should be protected at home. So you've got white supremacy feeding into this as well. And you don't have to tug at this too hard to realise that it doesn't stand up at all. It's complete and utter nonsense. But as with all of these things, it's powerful and it's in force, and you really don't have to look too far to see examples, even today, of the threat that, the sanctity of the white woman needs to be protected at all costs from possible corruption from people, particularly men of colour.
Particularly men of color. I mean, it's such a foundational element of white supremacy, right? The white woman making white babies, protect the appetites of men of color, and we see what that leads to in terms of violence. And
Exactly.
There's just one last thing that's on my mind is around sex education. And given everything we've talked about, the shame, the very heteronormative thing, and the protection of the innocence and the purity of young women, how do they get any information about what's coming for them? I did an episode recently on George Sand, the 19th century writer. I think you might have had her on your show as well, Fiona Sampson.
Yeah. She's brilliant.
And there was that quote from George Sand that lives in my head. We raise them like saints and we hand them over like fillies. What an indictment of the fate of young girls.
And she's right. It's one of the perennial questions, isn't it? Is where did women learn about sex? One of the things that you find turning up in the records a lot, I don't know if this was a universal experience, but it's weird how much it's there, is that men would learn about sex by going to a brothel. They would lose their virginity in a brothel, and that was where they learnt about sex. And certainly by the time you get to the 19th century, and there's lots of discussions about the quote-unquote great social evil, one of the defences being put forward by politicians is that it's needed. That's where boys go to learn about sex. Again, the mental gymnastics required to say, well, it's all right to have sex with these women who will socially shame in order to protect the virtue of these other women. It's crazy, but that's what they were doing. But where did women learn about it? If the emphasis is on preserving these virginal purity of women, they really were being just sent off into marriage with very little idea of exactly what was going to happen to them. There are a few places that we can attempt to see where people were learning about it, because just because no one wants to talk about it, just because there's a culture of silence, doesn't mean that people weren't talking about it. They absolutely were. Clelia Mosher was a 19th century American scientist, and she conducted one of the first ever sex surveys. It was never published, but thank God she did, and it's called the Mosher Survey, and you can go read it today. And she asks women things like, do you always have an orgasm when you have sex with your husband, and how many times do you have sex? And so you get this kind of idea that they are having quite a lot of sex, that they would quite like more sex, and that there is quite a lot of orgasms going on. Moving into the 20th century, there's another one called Catherine Beaumont Davis, who conducts a huge survey in 1929, and it's called Factors in the Sex Life of 2,200 Women. And in it, she asks really detailed questions, and one of them is, where did you learn about sex? And you get a real insight into where women 100 years ago were trying to learn about sex. And most of it is from their mother. Go and ask your mother. That seems to have been a fairly standard response. But they're also learning about sex from friends, from older siblings, from people at school, sometimes learning about it from doctors. But a lot of them say they didn't know about it until they actually got married, and then there was some questions about, would you like to have had better education? And most of them say yes, but some of them say no, because if they'd known what was coming, they never would have got married. Which is just so heartbreaking. But yeah, it's just this absolute plethora of sexual ignorance and what that leads to, and how that's internalized, and how that affects people. One of the really things to come out of Davis's survey is the shame that these women hold on to, because she asks them about masturbation as well, and almost unanimously they've done it, and almost unanimously they feel terrible about it. They feel so bad. There's even one woman in there that's surprised anyone else was doing it apart from her. She thought that she was the only person to have done this. They think that God's going to be angry with them. They think that they won't be fit for marriage. They feel that they're dirty, that they're shameful, that no one will give them a job. I don't know why they would think that they would know that they've been doing that. But the levels of shame that just radiate out of this text are really quite profound. And that's what happens when you're not educating people, because ignorance, it's willfully done to keep people in the dark about their sexual behaviour. Because if you want women to remain virgins and then have zero sexual experience until they get to their husband, and even then not to know anything about what is actually going to happen, so they've got nothing to compare it to, and certainly they can't ask for anything to be any better, then not telling them about it is a really useful way to do that. So the withholding of sex education is another form of control, of social control, particularly around women.
Mm-hmm. And thank goodness for these surveys, because with all of that shame, with so little information, like how do you as a historian even find this stuff out? Who's leaving records about their sex lives? And
I know.
Especially women, right?
Not many of them, and thank God for those who did. And I often tell people, like, keep a sex diary. Go and like keep it for a few years and bury it in the backyard, and it's useless right now, but for a historian in 100 years, that's absolute gold dust. There's a few examples of where people do write about their sex lives. Anne Lister, the lesbian diarist from the early 19th century, was one, and her work is so important. But you don't tend to get a lot of first-hand accounts. That's what's usually missing from the record, which is wild when you're looking at something like sex history, because like we all do it, but it's just no one's talking about it. And all the sources that you get, almost all the sources, are biased in some way. Like you can learn about the history of sex work by reading police records and court transcripts, but that's always biased because that's somebody who's on trial or somebody that is attempting to present themselves in a certain way. Or you can read medical texts, but again, they're usually mad and they're underpinned by patriarchal attitudes at the time. It's not getting to what people actually experienced. So when you've got accounts like that, they're so precious. And you can read Beaumont Davis's work on the Wellcome Trust's website, and I'd recommend that everybody go and do it, because she really has captured the voices of women 100 years ago, of what they were experiencing, what they were doing, how they thought about their sex lives.
I'll make sure to link to that. I want to just conclude to ask about you and why you do this work, because some might think it frivolous to write about sexual pleasure at a time when there are so many seemingly more pressing issues when it comes to women's rights, even within the realm of sexuality, whether that's reproductive freedom, sexual violence, trans identity. Like there's so many things that seem so urgent right now. Why write about pleasure?
Yeah, it can seem a little bit like you're rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It's like we've got bigger things to deal with than an orgasm. But for me, pleasure itself is often an undervalued and underexplored aspect of the human experience, because it's pleasurable and we like to do it. And so we often don't think about the good times that we're having. But your right to pleasure and to experience pleasure, for me, actually gets to the heart, the real heart of a lot of issues around gender-based violence and gender-based discrimination, because your right to pleasure is understanding your right to bodily autonomy. It's understanding your right to say, I don't have to perform during sex. I can ask for what I want. I can own my body. I have a right to this. I can demand this of somebody. It means that you have to understand your own body and not be ignorant about it, and you have the right to do that. It gets to the heart of consent and of respecting the body of the person that you are with in quite profound ways. So although pleasure might sound frivolous, the right to sexual pleasure and to not be hurt or coerced or feel that you're performing sex, for me, is absolutely central. I think sexual liberation is social liberation. And I think that still so many heterosexual women in particular are performing sex. Psychologists and sociologists call them sexual scripts, that we're all subjugated to, and that we have our sexual script of what we think is normal. The idea of virginity and penetration is a great example of that, of what we think that sex is. So we go into these encounters with scripts that are formed in maybe pornography that we've seen on TVs and movies, of people talking stuff, of what we think that sex should be. And so often heterosexual women are not having a fulfilling experience. There is a lot of work going on at the moment about the invisible labour of women, both at home and in the domestic sphere. And I think that we need to have the conversation around the invisible labour that women are doing in sex as well. Most women have faked an orgasm at some point, most of them. Men fake orgasms too, which is an interesting thing to learn during the research. And then I'm thinking, so if I'm faking and he's faking, what on earth are we doing here? What is happening? there'll be plenty of people listening to this that have faked orgasms. And I suppose my question to them is just like really sit with that and ask yourself, why did you do that? What? No judgment. I've done it myself. Like, why did you do that? Did you do that because you weren't going to orgasm and that you just wanted to wrap it up quite quick? Or did you do it because you didn't want to hurt his feelings? You want him to have a better experience? And in both of those cases, you're deprioritizing your own pleasure. You've become like a cheerleader in your own sexual pleasure. You're not advocating for yourself. And I think that it's so easy for women to do that, especially during sex, and having absorbed all of these messages for a millennia that we don't enjoy sex as much as men do. You see, and so that for me, sexual pleasure goes to the heart of women knowing their bodies, knowing what they deserve, and being able to ask for it as well.
Well, that's a good place to conclude. I have a final question that I'm introducing for every guest, and you'll be the first.
Okay.
So what's a moment in women's history or a moment in history that you think we should explore again from the perspective of women? And sort of bonus question, if you have a guest to talk about this that you recommend we get on the show.
I don't have a guest off the top of my head, but I think that the sexual revolution of the 1960s needs to be relooked at from women's point of view, because I think that like sex definitely changed in the 60s in the West. There was a revolution, but there was a revolution for some people, and the revolution wasn't for everybody. And we did not have sexual or gender equality, so therefore we did not have equality in sex. So I would like to dismantle the idea that it was a great and it was a free-for-all for absolutely everybody, because I think that it was much more of a sexual liberation for men, and that women were kind of being dragged along with that. So I would like that, the idea of the 1960s sexual revolution, to be looked at again. A perfect example of that is the Profumo affair. When that kicked off, that huge British scandal where it turned out that politicians do actually lie about it. And the shame that was heaped on the girl at the centre of this, Christine Keeler, who was 19 years old at the time, who'd had sex with the Secretary of Defence, John Profumo, who I think was late 40s, early 50s, and married. And she carried all the shame and she carried all the blame. And the way the newspapers spoke about her was appalling. I don't think that she had a sexual revolution. I think that those old attitudes are still absolutely, they were there and they were very formative. I would always say get Dr. Eleanor Yarniger on as a guest. She studies medievalism and the medieval period, and she has done some fantastic work on exploring some of the things that we were talking about today, but in the medieval period, the idea that like women have always worked. The idea that, you know, that women just put their feet up and were just staying at home. No, not true. And she's found amazing examples of like women doctors and women working in really like advanced and highbrow professions. So I'd always say get her on if you want to talk about what it's like to be a woman in the medieval period, because she's brilliant. She'd probably tell you about the 60s as well, but I'm not sure of exactly who would. I'm not sure which historians are working on that, but yeah, I'd like to see that revised.
Wonderful. Those are two great ideas. I'll get both on the books.
Fabulous.
Thank you so much, Kate. The book is called Flick. It comes out soon, right?
28th of May.
28th of May. So people can go ahead and pre-order it, and it'll be in our mailbox on the 28th. Thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
This was Dr. Kate Lister, author of Flick, A History of Female Pleasure. I do recommend you pick up the book. There was a lot more there than we got to in the conversation. As always, you can pre-order it in the Broad History Bookstore, which does support this show, supports independent bookstores throughout the UK, supports the author who kindly gave us her time and expertise, and supports you because you get a discounted price. So what's not to like? The link, as always, in the show notes and at broadhistory.com. The book is only available in the UK right now. Sorry, American listeners. Go ahead and petition your publishers so that someone picks it up. Next week, I'll be speaking with Megan Kate Nelson about myths of the American West and the frontier, and we'll be meeting some incredible women who belie anything you might think about pioneer women and I guess their modern day descendants, tradwives. So definitely do not miss that. It will be on the feed on Saturday next week, or much earlier if you sign up to become a Broad History member and support this show. It's at broadhistory.com/membership. Members get every episode early and ad-free. So this is your chance. Don't forget also another great way to support the show if you don't have the cash is to share it with your friends. I love that the listenership is growing, but we're still so small. There is much room to grow. Share it with your friends. Leave a review on whatever podcasting app that you're using. That's incredibly helpful. The 5 stars and then a few kind words if you may. And you can sign up for the newsletter at broadhistory.com. It's all free. Until then, this has been Broad History, and I've been your host, Isabelle Hogal. I'll talk to you next week.